The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining us today for our fifth meeting of the Rate Review Advisory Group. Welcome to both the members of the Rate Review Advisory Group and all our members of the public who are present. Our co-chair, Robert White, is unable to attend today, so I will be doing my best to answer all of your questions. And if there's something that I can't answer, we will certainly take that back and get you an answer as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So today's agenda includes important follow-up areas that we tracked from the last meeting. And we appreciate the members' use of the new request form that we developed for topics and for feedback. As we discussed last month, but worth restating, the FY23 budget will adjust rates both by the 4% COLA and the additional 4% from the supplemental budget. Our work around day habilitation is continuing to inform the FY24 budget, and that will, the work that we're doing that will conclude at the end of this rate setting cycle. And next slide, please. So a reminder that this advisory group is part of a new structure, which comes from Secretary Schrader and Deputy Secretary Simon's commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and mission of the DDA community. The commitment members have made to participate ensures an open and transparent process to review rates. Next slide, please. Members were sent an email with meeting minutes on June 7th. As chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
I'll second. This is Chris.
All right. And all in favor of approving the minutes from last month's meeting?
Hey, Jennifer, this is Karen Adams-Gilchrist. There is a misspelled name. My name is misspelled in the minutes.
Okay, we'll definitely make sure that gets corrected. Apologies for that. So with that change, all in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. In addition to the follow-up areas from last month's meeting, I do want to take a minute to acknowledge some of the good feedback and comments from both RAG members and other stakeholders. And it's important to know that all of this feedback is reviewed. Following the last meeting, there was a specific request from an RAG member around an individual briefing on self-directed services and how they relate to the DDA rates. Thank you for this request, and we will have a member of the DDA team engage directly with you to support this request for an overview. Also, there was a request from Max to present a rate analysis conducted by their actuaries. I've requested that a rate setting consultant's Optimus engage directly on this analysis and that we continue to move forward with a focus on data collection to inform the DAHAB rates in this rate setting cycle. As I mentioned last meeting, we committed to clear guidance so that everyone will have the same expectations around roles and responsibilities of the advisory group members, including the MDH representatives, and the practices of this advisory group as a public engagement tool bound by the Maryland Open Meetings Act. Since the last meeting, we received guidance to change the title of this document from bylaws to policies. This is a technical change, and the substance of what you have reviewed will remain the same. Specific to employment services, Patricia will update on the confirmed approach for the assessment and engagement of on employment services in LTSS Maryland. And finally, regarding the FIAT, Optimus will share additional analysis today as a follow-up on the good discussion and requests from last month's meeting. And in addition, following this meeting, the DDA will share with the provider network 2 versions of the FIAT tool as requested. One will be a locked version with the FY23 rate update, and a second version which will be unlocked that can be used by providers for their internal planning and use. Should fiscal impact data be shared with the state, it will be requested that you submit that on the locked version to ensure consistency across the network, but you'll still have the unlocked version that you can use when you're doing your own projections. I will now turn it over to Patricia from DDA to talk about employment services.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you guys are having a great Friday. Following the discussion from the last meeting around employment, we would like to start working with the early adopter group and those pilot providers currently offering employment services in LTSS Maryland DDA module. This targeted engagement will best help us to review the policy assumptions and their expectations to provide us with some baseline recommendations. Our plan is to engage with these providers this summer and to start with collecting qualitative information around both their rate and their policy experiences. This effort will be shared back with this group to provide informed future rate review recommendations. I just wanted to make sure you had that overview and follow up from our last meeting. I'm going to turn this over to Chris.
Patricia, I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
If you're working with early adopters around employment, I'm trying to think through. If you're thinking, are you talking about the original 5?
No, we're thinking of the original 5, and we're also thinking of the anybody that has transitioned into LTSS who are already doing the employment services, because we want to get a really good understanding of their experiences, and also how are they interpreting some of the service definitions and how the policy that we put together, so we can get some really good feedback from that group. Does that answer your question?
But yes, I just want to make sure that it includes providers who provide employment supports to people with more significant support needs.
Yeah, we're going to include everyone that is already in billing for employment services in the LTSS, because I think what we want to understand is when they're providing that service, are they matching the actual service definition or any policy that we put out there, so we can learn and see, is there any gaps? Is there any concerns? How do we move forward? So we do want to make sure that we include those providers that are already using and billing employment services.
Right. So I would just say, I would still, I worry that there are providers who have not transitioned to LTSS because of concerns about the rates, particularly those who support people with more intense needs. So I would just ask DDA to look at that to make sure that that perspective is getting included.
Thank you, Laura. We'll take that into consideration. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, and whoever's advancing the slides, can you make sure we're in the right slide? I just want to be sure, because we're still in the slide of the bylaws. Yeah. And I just want to make sure that this is, I spoke about this because there's other things we talked about on employment services. All right, now I'm going to turn over to Chris from Optimus. Next slide, please.
Hi, are you guys able to hear us okay?
Yes,
okay.
Chris.
Looks like some nodding. All right, thanks. Just doing some technical differences being in the office, but yeah, thanks for that. So we wanted to walk through the FIAT report summary and provide some details. So, you know, we had heard kind of a high-level summary in the past that just looked at those overall impacts, and there were some questions that we had and that you all shared with us. And so we've done a few additional reviews. So the intent here is to walk through some of those additional reviews. So here's the 3 that we're kind of taking a look at today. We'll look at the providers that just are limited to that service category. So what I mean by that is in the past, we compared a provider's PCIS revenue to their LTSS projected revenue with all of their components combined. In this case, we're only looking at their meaningful day revenue in the past and their meaningful day revenue in the future, regardless of whether or not they provided other services. We also want to compare the variances of those net positive or negative changes in revenue and how that relates to the distribution of staffing for services. You know, we heard some questions about whether or not 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 staffing ratio services may have a different revenue impact, or a large group may have a different revenue impact compared to the other components. And then the third thing we have here is looking at the variance of net positive or negative changes in revenue that are based on those categories within meaningful day services. So, you know, if a provider offers more CDS or more day hab services, et cetera, we wanted to see how that might impact their revenue projections. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide here. And we just wanted to keep a few things in mind as we're looking at this. No data set is perfect, so we wanted to just make sure we're all kind of on the same page in how we're interpreting this. So those rates applied in the FIAT are blended, and the projected revenue varies based on those assumptions that providers made around their utilization and their mix of services. So there may need to be some adjustments to those assumptions if we're trying to see how things would look, if we're trying to match policy or allow for a more comparable review. The FIAT compares the PCIS2 revenue to the expected revenue based on those assumptions, but it doesn't necessarily reflect changes in profitability. There's also considerations to be made for varying assumptions made by different providers as they completed the tool. Some of the providers filled out the FIATs based on their current PCIS2 services and their interpretation of how those services map to LTSS. Others may have completed it based on assumed or authorized utilization of services by members under the new system. And finally, changes to the rates have been made since the release of the FIAT and generally have resulted in increased rates. So just in general, I think all of the information that we're sharing today, all the data and the graphs that we'll share with you are using that repriced data. So what we've done is whatever the rates existed when the FIAT was released, we've updated the summaries to use the fiscal year 23 rates. So there are some changes there, but that's the only change we've done on a kind of rate basis. All right, so we'll move on to that next slide, which is, you know, again, going back to what those three things we're looking at. So we're just going to take a look first at that.
Sua chamada está em espera. Por favor, aguarde. Your call is on hold. Please hold the line.
Not sure who that was, but we'll try to see how it goes. So we've got, again...
A sua chamada está em espera. Por favor, aguarde. Your call is on hold. Please hold the line.
All right, so we're getting some weird response there. Make sure, if you're not talking, please make sure you're muted.
A sua chamada está em espera. Por favor, aguarde. Your call is on hold. Please hold the line.
Chris, this is Carrie. Before you start, I wonder
A sua chamada está em espera. Por favor, aguarde. Your call is on hold. Please hold the line.
I wonder if we can tell. It has to be a panelist, I believe. And so if we have a way to mute a panelist, we might want to do that before we get started
Sua
again.
chamada está em espera. Por favor, aguarde. Your call is on hold. Please hold the line.
It's a person on a phone call.
Okay, yeah, I think that might have just gotten muted. So I think we'll see if that goes forward. It's always fun, you know, doing all this stuff in the pandemic. Definitely had some 100-person plus calls with toilet flushes in the background. So at least we're not that bad today, but we'll try to keep it rolling here. So that FIAT report summary, you know, bringing us back to a couple slides ago, we talked about those three options, three ways of looking at it. So we're just going to start with that first one. The first data exploration is looking at providers on just that service category specific impact. So again, we're looking at just their meaningful day revenue in the past and just their projected meaningful day revenue using those utilization assumptions. There's no impacts from other services like residential. So we'll move on to the next slide and start walking through, taking a look at some of the details here. So we had presented a graph like this in the past, in the last RAG meeting, that was kind of a preliminary look at about 15 or so providers. And so this is a similar graph, but we've updated this to incorporate all of the FIATs that we received. So this first scatter plot, it's showing that estimated change, again, meaningful day only revenue from PCIS2 to LTSS based on the FIAT data as it was input by the providers. Based on, going left to right there, we have the average number of hours provided by an agency per person per day. So each dot represents one provider. So we, again, this is expected utilization that the providers put in. We haven't made any adjustments there. We did make adjustments to those, put this on a fiscal year 23 rate basis. So what we can see here, looking just kind of quickly as we, look left to right is the average hours per person per day, and bottom to top is that revenue change impact projection. Similar kind of story that we were talking about last time, where you see that positive correlation. The more average hours per person per day, the more positive a revenue change, and vice versa. And we understand that there are providers that are below and above that middle 0% kind of dark black line. But there's that correlation that we're seeing. I'll also note that when we're talking about per person per day hours, we are only taking into account the 15-minute unit services. If providers are offering monthly or milestone services, we don't have any way of understanding exactly how much time they're spending there. So we have just ignored that piece. So this is only a representation of those 15-minute unit services.
Hi, this is Scott. Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any, from what I understood you to say, is you're comparing FY22 PCIS income to FY23 income? Do you have any concerns that you're not really comparing? It seems like you're not comparing the same income. Do you have any concerns about that?
Sure. I think, we were trying to kind of update to use the most recent information available. But that's certainly, a responsible or a reasonable way to look at that. Since there had been some changes to the rates, we didn't want to kind of leave those out. So we did, put this in here. But to your point, this is based on historic PCIS2 revenue against projected future, 23 revenue.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so we can move on to the next slide. And this is going to be a little bit.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I couldn't
get
it fast enough before you moved on to the next slide. Can you just one more time go through the point that Scott was making, that I understand what you're comparing in 23, but I'm sorry, what were you comparing it to in 22?
Sure. So the FIAT tool asked providers to put in the revenue they experienced from PCIS2, and then the expected utilization for the new services, and then would calculate that projected revenue based on that projected utilization. So from the PCIS2, the starting point comparison, they put in their historical revenue, and for the projection, they're looking at anticipated future revenue. And I think, to Scott's point, one of the things that we did to try to account for some of the changes that occurred in the rates is we've replaced the FIAT tool rates with the fiscal year 23 rates to be the most up to date. But to Scott's point, that's comparing a PCIS2 past revenue to a projected future revenue with future rates.
Well, it's also comparing FY22, which is, clearly has very different utilization in light of COVID and Appendix K. So I guess I'm not sure how much this really tells us.
Yeah, I was very curious of the same point. It goes back to our discussion we had at the last meeting, you know, not knowing exactly which data to compare it to, but because of utilization, because of COVID, that's going to be lower.
So this is a pretty standard analysis where you take historical revenue and you compare it to projected future revenue. Do you have a suggestion for an alternative that you would prefer to see?
If we're using, Chris, if we're using LTSS FY23 numbers, we also have FY23 PCIS2 numbers at this point. I don't know why we wouldn't be comparing 23 to 23.
So that's, you know, not information that we had available at the time. If that's something that, you know, the state is interested in having those changes made and disseminating updated information, that's something that we could look into. This is, you know, again, like we mentioned, there's no data set that's going to be perfect in every way. We're trying to make the best use of the data that we have kind of available at the time. So it sounds like if that fiscal year 23 PCIS2 data is available, then we may be able to make some adjustments there, but this is kind of what we have available at the moment.
Chris, I would just say, to the point that this is a standard comparison, that would make complete sense when we are not still operating under a pandemic. It just, that baseline data is not going to tell us the real impact as a comparison for the new rates.
Okay, so first let me go back, Laura. I'm going to ask Chris. You said fiscal year 23 PCIS data, or did I misunderstand that, Chris? I apologize.
FY23 PCIS2 rates. I mean, if you've bumped the LTSS rates, you know, 8%, and we're comparing them to last year's PCIS2 rates that are not including the 8%, then your entire chart is shifted up 8%.
Okay, and then to Laura's point, Laura, the pandemic is still ongoing. We're going to have to pick a utilization base point. We've had this conversation as part of the advisory group. We can't ignore all of the historical information. And so we need to utilize that information as part of the projections.
I understand that, but what providers were asked to do in terms of completing the FIAT was, most providers that I spoke with used utilization projections that did not really factor in COVID. They factored in, excuse me, a reduction in what would be billable, as was advised by DDA. But it's, you're taking, you know, if the projection was COVID utilization to COVID utilization, then that would make sense. But I'm struggling with having the baseline. To me, it would inaccurately boost what the revenue increase looks like.
So yeah, I think there, you know, obviously we have similar concerns where we're looking at the data. We know that there's different ways that providers built in those assumptions, and we understand that this some of this data represent experience during the pandemic. So we do have those kind of difficulties that we have to deal with. So, you know, we can try to keep those things in mind as we look at this. We're not trying to say that any specific result here is, you know, absolute and final in every case, but really we're trying to give you guys kind of a picture of how things may look. And I think this can be useful in generating some ideas. we're not, looking at this and saying, okay, this specific provider is at this percentage, so we're going to make this percentage adjustment there. It's really just kind of to give us some context of how we're getting those results. But yeah, absolutely, we want to keep caveats like those that you guys have brought up in mind as we're looking at this, and make sure that we're appropriately contextualizing it.
Chris and Steve, this is Chris. Just real quick, two thoughts. You've got a heavy group of providers here at 5 hours and a heavy group at 6 hours. I think we're going to find that utilization projection may be a little high. I shift those two groups down your diagonal line to 4, 4.5, or 5 in that ballpark. That changes the picture quite significantly. And then take and shift the whole chart down 8%. You've got more than half of your providers that are going to be posting a loss. You're close to that now just with this, without any kind of a utilization adjustment, and the fact that we've got the variance between 22 and 23 built into this model. Is there any possibility at some point that we could actually see hard numbers? I mean, I'm a numbers guy, statistics, dots all over the page to paint a picture, but I like actually seeing numbers. Are we able to see provider A, and don't need names, provider A, here's the projected net income from the FIAT tool or loss from the FIAT tool, and then the gain or loss actually by program. I think how they interact within a program too, a program that has heavy CDS versus a heavy day program, it would be pretty clear indicator to us that where our benchmark is really going to hit. I'm scared about this analysis and the fact that I truly believe 5 and 6 are going to slide down that line, and then we slide back down 8%, and again, more than half your providers are in the hole. And I don't think that's what the process, when we started the rate setting process, that's what was intended.
Sure. So let me try to address those questions the best I can here. First, if you're interested in looking at raw data, I think that would be subject to the state making that decision. I know there have been concerns about sharing, provider level data in the past, and some of this, depending on what you want to do with that information, especially if you're trying to look at average hours per person per day and where those services lie, it tends to kind of need to be on an individual basis within a provider setting. So I think that's a discussion that would need to be had with the state. I'm not sure if anyone on the state side is comfortable speaking to that at the moment. I'll just pause for a second and see if you want to weigh in there.
I think we can take that discussion back internally, along with a lot of the other points that you all have been bringing up related to this slide. We'll definitely discuss it.
So, and I have a related question, I guess, that came up on the last call that I'm not sure if this is the right place to insert this question, but goes back to some conversation about decisions that individual providers make in terms of determining that they will only serve people who are seeking a minimum number of hours and the policy implications of that. And I think that, kind of adding on to Chris's point about, if you shift this downwards and you understand that many providers may only end up delivering services to a person 2 to 4 hours a day, and that may be driven by the person's preferences and their needs, and the consistency with the department policy, unrelated to just rates, but broadly across the waiver, to ensure that people are able to, braid different services across a day, may even be braiding different providers across a day. I guess, as you're doing this analysis and thinking about the policy implication of that factor, and whether the department will be providing any guidance around the ability of providers to do that or not do that, because it doesn't feel very person-centered to be able to say, well, we'll only serve you if you'll take at least 3 to 5 hours a day, because we can only make the economic model work. I think there's that policy issue that also needs to be addressed.
Yeah, those are fair comments. I heard both you and Chris mention potentially sliding down some of the utilization assumptions that providers put in. Based on our discussions with the state, that was not something that sounded appropriate for us to do at the time. If that's something that you all are interested in talking about, you think that that's a more reasonable projection, again, that's something that could be entertained on the state side. But we were really looking at how providers shared that feedback or populated these templates. So there are, we see many of them around 6 hours per day, for example. And we also were trying to look at how this compares to the DDA policy goals and expectations. So I think we wanted to walk through some other views that we had done here, some adjustments that we had made, and have a space for that discussion around those expectations and what those hours per day might look like, or how different providers might handle that. So if that's okay with you all, we might just kind of walk through the next couple of graphs just to give us some additional context, and then have that discussion.
Chris, before you go, and you can stay on this slide, one just last point. We have data, almost 12 months full of data from the original early adopter group. Can we see where they're at with utilization from their original projections and what they've actually seen over the past 12 months? That's going to be a good indicator. I mean, they went into that version of the FIAT tool before they went in as an early adopter and did projections. Were they looking at 5 to 6, and have they hit 4 to 5? We've got data. Can we now get some feedback from those early adopters to see where they would actually hit on this chart based on their reality instead of projections?
Yeah, again, so I think that's a fair question. Providing that data, again, would be up to the state, and I think up to the EAG providers, since that would be pretty individualized. We also, had discussed back and forth some options about collecting and sharing data. And so while that may be useful for the reasons that you provided, they have that experience. There also may be concerns about trying to generalize from a fairly small sample. So we were trying to have a kind of a broader group here, but again, there's kind of pros and cons either way. There's some caveats you'd have to account for either way. So that concept of looking at that provider data or making that available with regards to the EAG experience, I think that would be something for the state to consider how they're interested in responding there.
If that's something that we could put in our parking lot for a future meeting to follow up on, I would appreciate.
Sure. Yeah, we've noted that. It sounds like they've probably heard you on the state side as well, and we'll make sure that we follow up with them to see the plan forward there. All right, so the next couple of slides, we'll stay on the one that we're on currently here. We're just going to show you a couple different looks that we did. Again, we're not saying that this is kind of our projection of what's going to happen, or stating one way or another how certain providers will, have these experiences. But I think we wanted to just take a couple of looks to see how things may change if there were certain kind of policy goals or operational changes based on our understanding from the state's policy goals. So this first one here, we're showing essentially the same information as the previous slide. It's arrayed in the same format, but we have made adjustments to utilization here. So what we've done is anyone who had monthly or milestone services, we did not make any changes to their utilization. Anyone who was above 4 hours per person per day, we did not make any changes to their utilization. If an individual had only 15-minute unit services and they had an average of less than 4 hours per day, we scaled their services proportionally up to 4 hours per day. So if, for example, they had 1 hour of day hab and 1 hour of CDS in the past, our projection would be that they would have 2 hours of day hab and 2 hours of CDS in the future. And we understand that there are Again, we can't necessarily make that assumption. We don't know how providers would react there, that maybe it would be 3 hours a day have and 1 hour of CDS or vice versa, if there were any changes. But this is kind of looking at a view if we were to bring providers up to a 4 hour, per person per day average of those 15-minute unit services. So I know we probably have some questions. I'm just going to go through the next 3 slides here because these are all kind of the same context, and that will give us, additional information. We can have that additional discussions there. So the next slide we have is our slide 12 here is going to be the blue dots and the orange dots, which is essentially those first 2 graphs combined. So those blue dots tend to be a little bit farther to the left. The orange dots are those providers tend to shift a little bit more to the right when those average hours per person per day are adjusted. And we do see, some increases as expected in that percent revenue change. So the orange dots tend to be a little bit farther to the right and a little bit higher up. I'll just point out some things that may be a little bit confusing when you're looking at this. So we do see some providers in, for example, the 1 hour per person per day kind of range, and that would indicate that either many or all, most of their individuals had monthly or milestone services, which is why they didn't move all the way over to 4 hours, because we did not make adjustments to those utilization expectations. Again, trying to be mindful that there is some service being delivered there and we just can't necessarily account for it. So we didn't want to make any assumptions about what could be done with it. So the next 2 slides, if we go to the next one, it's going to be the exact same as the one we looked at 2 prior, only this is an adjustment on the same basis to 6 hours per person per day, which sounded like that was in line with what DDA's expectations were. And again, we're seeing things move farther to the right, meaning more average hours per person per day, and farther up, meaning a more positive revenue change. And then slide 14, the following one, again, we're looking at the comparison of the blue dots would be that raw data, the raw utilization. And then the orange dots would be that adjusted if we were to make an assumption that providers were offering about 6 hours of services per day. But we'll just, I know we had a lot of questions and comments there, so I wanted to just provide that context, and we'll see if there's any questions, comments, or discussion we want to have here.
Chris, it's Laura. Just a comment. I kind of bristle a little bit when you say DDA's expectations was 6 hours a day, because there are certainly people who want and are ready for 6 hours, maybe even 8 hours, but so many people are not in that place. So, I mean, it's a lovely exercise, but it's not person-centered, person-driven, and I really have an issue with kind of just again, it feels like kind of an intellectual exercise, but it's not what we're seeing in the community.
This is Bernie. Let me respond to that and say, Laura, I think that the goal is 6. I think that what we've seen is, and we support the model based upon 4 to 6 hours per day. I also just want to point out that, we talk about day services, et cetera. And I think we need to look at all of our supports for individuals based upon, what they want to do in the community, et cetera, and not just focus on, we're looking at meaningful day. I mean, you could have, somebody doing employment, somebody doing pre-employment and whatever. And conversation seems at times to say, well, somebody's only going to do day have for X amount of hours a day. Well, I think when we go back and we start taking a look at what the teams have done and what the providers have reviewed and the person-centered plan, and we have to stay person-centered. I agreed. Donna raised this comment last time, and I agreed 110% with her and other folks who are part of this group. But, you know, I think we need to say, so what does it look like? And how do we help people, and how do we help people to engage in the community? We still got the community settings rule. We know we've got COVID going on, et cetera. But what does that look like as we continue to move forward? And what does that do to the fiscal viability of the provider when, you know, you review the plan, you say, okay, Johnny wants CDS and he wants employment and pre-employment and all this stuff. And I assume that the providers are doing that analytical review for the people who are in their agencies. I'll stop there. I mean, it's just, you know, I just want to emphasize that we are staying with person-centeredness.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Bernie, and I know that is always your goal. I just think, you know, the concept of having a certain number of hours as a goal across a day, it's you know, it's just like everybody else. We see lots of people making decisions that no longer want to work full time. And so I think, you know, that old model of 6 hours, it will absolutely still be viable for some people, but I think there are a number of people for whom, you know, they may never say, I want to be doing something, you know, all day, every day. So I would just caution about,
well,
you know.
That's kind of what I'm kind of reacting to, Laura. I don't think that somebody's going to want to do something 5 days a week or 6 hours a day. I mean, you know, we all do that because that's the way the nature of our jobs. You know, you've got somebody who's living in residential services or living at home with a family who says, you know, I want to go out and do some volunteer work. I want to go to the local animal shelter and volunteer. In the afternoon, I want to do some job exploration, etc. I think we need to get more creative on mixing and matching to say, well, what is the individual's interest, as opposed to they don't feel like they want to work. What are we going to do? Let people, you know, sit at home? I mean, I think that we've got more of the providers who are engaging with the people that they're providing supports to get us to get individuals that they're providing supports to a much better place.
Yeah, I would just say that I think there are people who I don't know if it's up to us to say whether we let them sit at home. I guess I would say I would like to get a sense of, hopefully we're supporting them in a way that folks have a lot of rich options, and there are things they want to be doing, whether it's work or, you know, whatever, CDS, through any support. But I just don't know when if or when we'll get back to that concept of most people taking advantage of daytime supports, you know, for such a big period of time. But I think we're kind of in a lot of ways saying the same thing.
I agree. I think we are. I think that the issue is going to be, how do we take the additional services going from 30 to 40 or a little over 40 or whatever, and how do we think differently at the annual review and have discussion with people that's their ISP, and basically say, well, you know, these are some additional options that you may have. I mean, we've been doing business the same way for a long time. I mean, you know, at one point, I think we only had like 17 waiver definitions or whatever in services. And so, you know, as we try to get better and a richer development, I think, you know, case management is going to be the linchpin, as we always say, but the provider at the end of the day is where the rubber meets the road with a lot of this.
I think I would just like.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead. Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. This is Karen Adams-Gilchrist. And Deputy Secretary Simons, I agree with all that you're saying, and it does sound exactly like what we are doing in the provider community, is that engagement with people to figure out what they want to do in their life, and that flexibility that we want people to have in their lives. What makes me anxious is when we see a number of charts with dots that have been moved to adjust to make adjustments makes me feel like we're building a rate structure that doesn't align with the intent of how we deliver services. That makes me anxious. It makes me anxious whenever someone says 6 hours is in line with DDA expectations, when what I hear you saying is figure out what's important to people and how we support people to have those services in their lives. When I see this, it makes me anxious, as that's not the rate structure that we're necessarily building. It doesn't feel like it.
This is Greg. Just a comment for consideration is when you look at this, it's a complex issue because a provider that's providing 6 or 7 hours in this model is seemingly doing well. A provider that is providing 1 or 2 or 3 hours is seemingly losing their shirt. And I guess the question is, like, how do you bridge those two things? Like, as a provider, I can't expect to be paid for an entire day to work with somebody 1 or 2 hours. But I also shouldn't have to keep somebody in services a certain amount of time that they don't want to be in services just for a model to work. And I think that we're looking at this a little bit as if we've got to come up with a rate that works across all of those different things, and it doesn't. It just flat out doesn't. Maybe there needs to be exceptions for some of the more complex individuals that are only going to be able to be supported a couple of hours a week, and you don't try to cram that into a meaningful day flow chart that has a 15-minute increment that's only going to allow you to draw a certain amount of money. Likewise, one of the things to DDA's credit, I think, that they have said historically is all of this allows us as providers to look at our business models, and it does. But we also have to align our business models with the values that we expose as a community around the people that we support. So, I'm having a hard time seeing somebody being able to present to this group in a flow chart a comparison like this where we all go, yeah, that's going to work, because it's got to be so much more individualized, especially for people that require more supports and more intensity of their needs. And I don't want the feel that's coming from the provider community to say whether it's 1 hour or 8 hours, you should be paying me the same amount of money. That's not what we're saying. Well, what we are saying is that for folks, there's a critical mass in every business decision that's ever made. The more of a service you deliver, unless it's not funded properly fundamentally, the more of it you deliver, the more efficient it's going to be. But this isn't really about efficiency. This is about a person-centered approach to a significant number of individuals that, instead of 1 hour a day, from an efficiency standpoint, 5 hours, 1 day a week works great. But you know what? That's not what they need. What they need is 1 hour a day. But those are exceptions. And I think that we have to figure out how to carve those around a model that makes sense, that keeps us on our toes in terms of making sure we're providing great supports. But the worst thing that any of us want to be faced with is to be talking to a person with a disability and saying, I'd love to help you, but there's just no way for me to do it because there's not a mechanism financially for any of us to make it work for you. I think that's where this discussion at some point needs to go around meaningful day supports, as opposed to trying to create an Excel structure in a flow chart where everybody goes, okay, I figured out how to make it work.
So this is Chris Welch from Optimus again. I hear what you guys are saying, and I appreciate there's a lot of good insight and feedback there. I just wanted to point a couple things out, just again, so that we're all kind of on the same page. When we're looking at the FIAT tool as it was presented, it asked for providers to input the expected utilization per week. To your point, if someone had maybe 1 day where they have 6 hours and that's all they're interested in for the week. We don't necessarily know that or have a way to account or adjust for that. And like you said, maybe that's more of an outlier case. So I just wanted to point that out there. And the next piece is just, again, for context, when we tend to look towards the left side of the graph and we see providers that are offering, 1 to 3, maybe 4 hours a day of services on average, there tends to be a little bit more of a relationship where they are using more of the monthly or milestone services. And like we mentioned, a few slides back, we have a few ways of kind of looking at the data that we wanted to share with you today. So we will get into a couple other slides here where we look at how things relate between, CDS utilization versus revenue change, or day have versus revenue change, or the milestone and monthly versus revenue change. So that may be useful information there. And then the last point, again, I hear what you guys are saying, that there may be differences for individuals, and it might not be appropriate to have everyone in there for 6 hours per day. We're trying to model based on our understanding of what the program would look like on average or expectations moving forward. So it may not be appropriate in every situation, and whether or not those adjustments need to be, or those assumptions need to be adjusted, that's kind of, we're looking to DDA on those kind of decisions around what hours per day, are expected or how that might be blended. So I think those are, reasonable points there. Just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page for how we're looking at this.
Hey, Chris Parks. Laura, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a point, which is because there are, a couple charts that scale up to 6 hours. And I just think that, when we see that, it feels like we run the risk of someone saying, well, as long as, you just support people for 6 hours a day, you'll be fine financially. And because we know on the provider side or the community side that that is not going to be reasonable. And in fact, as DDA actually said, don't presume you're going to be able to bill for the same number of hours in LTSS as you provided, even back in the old days when we provided, fuller days than we are now. So this just feels, just want to state the obvious and say, what you're hearing is a lot of concern about, this leading to a statement of, well, the rates are good. You just need to do, you and people we support need to just do 6 hours.
Laura, this is Steve. I don't think the message is intended to be that you need to do 6 hours for everyone. I think the message is intended to be that there will be a blend of individuals. And so we appreciate that feedback. And Chris, I apologize, I interrupted you.
Steve, no, you're good. The point I really want to make, and I don't want to lose this in the conversation, is that when we're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 hours of services for an individual, we're talking about billable time. That does not translate. A 6 hour billable day is going to translate into a 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5 hour day for an individual. So, as we consider individual choice, I may not want an 8 hour day, which means my provider is not going to be able to bill 6 because I've got the transportation component in there. So when we're discussing the billable day or the billable hour part, please realize that that is not the number of hours that the individual would choose to participate in the program. It's going to be more than that because of the transportation component.
Very helpful feedback, Chris. Appreciate that.
I think it also, this is Donna, it goes back to what was said earlier about the a number of the folks that are supported with very, very significant needs, whether they're medical or behavioral. And quite frankly, it doesn't always come down to their choice, but it comes down to their tolerance. or their need for a shortened day. And I just really want to make sure whatever we're moving forward with, those group of folks they need to continue to have choices of providers to go to without a rate driving their choice. And so there is some real legitimate concerns for those group of folks who, as I said, it's really not a choice of the number of hours. It's what they can tolerate or what is, feasible for them medically.
Donna, that's great feedback. We appreciate that that input. I think your comment and Greg's comment get at this idea of the rate structure and is a blend the appropriate approach or does it need to include adjustment factors? Jennifer or Bernie, you guys comfortable with us moving on?
Yes, I think in the interest of time, why don't we walk through the rest of the analysis as well? And of course, we will continue to take all of your feedback.
Great. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is Leslie. So the next 3 slides that we'll be looking at will address the point that's highlighted in this slide here, which is comparing the variances in the changes in revenue based on the staffing distribution for the services. So looking at proportions of 2-to-1, 1-to-1, and large group. That was the request that was made, and so we've been looking at how that varies across the different services. Next slide, please. So the first one we're looking at is CDS. And so from top to bottom is that revenue change from meaningful day in PCIS2 to meaningful day in LTSS. We aren't able to parse out that revenue by the specific services, but we are able to look at that distribution based on the proportion of CDS services that were reported as 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing. And so that the information from left to right is just of the CDS utilization that was reported in the FIAT, how much of that utilization is reported as 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. And so we can see here that there isn't really any significant impact to a provider's revenue as the portion of 2-to-1 and 1-to-1 services increases. It's kind of all over the place. There isn't really a pattern that we're seeing emerge.
Leslie, I'm sorry, can you maybe explain that a little more in terms of how do we know, I mean, not to ask a really simplistic question, but what does each dot represent as it relates to 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing?
Sure. So if we pick the point at 25%, we'll say that the provider of the CDS utilization that a provider put into the FIAT, 25% of their CDS utilization is reported as 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing. And so that provider is showing a 50% increase in the revenue for a meaningful day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that now I have a better sense. Thank you.
Any other questions? Great. Next slide, please. So we did the same exact look for day habilitation. So again, of the utilization reported for day habilitation, we're looking at what percentage or what portion of that utilization was 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing. And so again, we see here that as the portion of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 increases, we aren't really seeing either a positive or negative change to the total meaningful day revenue. We do see for the first 25%, there is a slight increase, but that's not a very strong correlation, and so we can't make any strong conclusions from that. Any questions, comments?
I guess I would just ask, do we know if there is anything else that would affect this? I know anecdotally from talking to providers with data that they felt like they saw when they completed their FIATs that if they had more dedicated hours, so particularly 1-to-1 staffing, that really shifted where they landed financially. So I'm kind of surprised by this.
Yeah, and that's why we did this looks into the data, because that was the theory that we were hearing from the prior meeting, was that the higher their portions of 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 staffing, the more profit or the higher revenue change they experienced. And so that's this is just what the data is showing. However, there's always additional digging we can do into the data, because this is not it's not a finalized conclusion, or we're not definitively saying that it does or doesn't impact one way or another. This is just what the data is telling us at the moment.
I'll just add on there. Sorry, go ahead.
Whether whether this was, they're controlled at all for the number of hours, average hours per day?
So in this chart, there's no adjustments to any utilization at all. This is just as the providers shared it. So we wouldn't know, based on the way we had pulled the information, whether certain groups of these have more or less hours. I just also wanted to add on, I know Leslie shared some of the information about how to interpret these, and it's a lot of information that we're throwing at you guys at once, and I appreciate you guys, taking some time and looking at this through the lens that's appropriate for you. We just to, again, in the interest of transparency and having that context here, we do not have in this graph a day habilitation comparison in the past to a day habilitation comparison in the future. What we do have is a full meaningful day revenue in the past to a full meaningful day revenue in the future. So if you do hear from providers that there are things that are specific to day habilitation that may be correlated more in that manner, but we did not have that information available to us. We don't have PCIS2 by day habilitation. We have it by meaningful day. And similarly, we have those projections by meaningful day. So just wanted to make sure that that information is available to help interpret these graphs.
This is Scott. Question on the interpretation of this. We've been looking at graphs that talk about hours of service. When I look at this graph, I'm interpreting that there's a lot of providers that are below the line in total revenue. Am I correct in interpreting that as, regardless of hours, all those blue dots are going to lose money?
So yes, this is again a summary based on the data that are provided to us. So these are kind of those raw data points from the FIAT tools using the assumptions that providers put in. This is a subset of providers. It is only the providers who are providing day habilitation. But yes, the 0% kind of dark line there is no revenue change for meaningful day. Below that would represent a revenue reduction, and above that would represent a revenue increase based on the assumptions that were put into those FIAT tools.
And I'm assuming that we're using FY23 LTSS rates.
Yes, these are using the FY23 rates.
And it just gives me pause. You know, I've been looking at all these numbers with 4 hours, 6 hours, and I think that's, you know, it's very important. But now I'm thinking, oh my golly, all those people are going to be losing money. That's a little disconcerting. But that's my
not only that, but it's the group of people who require the 1-to-1 or the 2-to-1 staffing, the same group I was talking about earlier. And this chart really drives the point I was trying to make home. It's a very sad chart for those folks. It is very sad to look at that chart for those folks. And they may not be the larger number of people that are supported, but there's still people that desperately rely on the support of providers such as ours and others. It comes down
to Optimist team, can you clarify this chart for everyone for a second? Is this is my understanding is this is revenue change, not necessarily change in profitability. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Am I accurate in saying that?
Yes, that's an accurate statement. Also wanted to point out, because there may be some misinterpretation going on here, if you look all the way to the right, where it's 100%, that means that those two dots there, or, you know, or if there's more that are kind of blended, if those two providers for dehabilitation, they only provided 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing. And so the providers who are doing that exclusively are the ones who have, they show a revenue increase. When we look at the left-hand side of the graph, where there are, you know, quite a few dots in between those first two sections of -50% to +50%, those are providers who offer many more, much more utilization in the small group or large group setting, and very limited in terms of 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. The ones all the way on the left, where it's 0%, those are the ones who have absolutely no 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing in their dehabilitation. So just a point of clarification on interpreting the graph there.
I guess I am confused because that, I would have never assumed that by looking at that chart, because it does say revenue change by portion of day with 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. I don't know, that's very confusing to me. It's probably me, but it's very confusing.
Chris, can I just, and Leslie, can I just take a quick crack at this? That, because I think you explained it in the earlier chart, but it's still, because there's so little explaining what the chart is on the graphic, it's a little hard. But so if you are a provider who provides no 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing, you're on that 0% left-hand side, you essentially have a 50-50 shot of being above or below that zero, you know, that kind of break-even dark line. And it really doesn't get to where you will definitely be above break even until you get to maybe the 40% percentage or so. Is that a fair description of at least what we see on this chart?
Is that dark line, is that a break even line, or is that just below, or saying that your revenue either increases or doesn't increase? Is that's not a break even line, right? That's not profit or not profitable, right? I'm confused.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, Karen.
Yeah, I think you're correct there.
Yeah, I mischaracterized that. I apologize. But nonetheless, it takes until you get over to about 40% of the people you support, you provide 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing.
To start to see an increase in your revenue.
Yeah, or well, to be above, yeah.
Above, yeah.
So that would be one interpretation of the graph, but like I had mentioned at the beginning, and Chris has said it again, The revenue change is total meaningful day compared to total meaningful day. We weren't able to break out day habilitation to day habilitation. And so to a point that you mentioned earlier, Laura, these are just observations we're making, but there could be other factors that are impacting this. Well, for instance, maybe a provider is providing all milestones and monthlies, and so their revenue isn't actually impacted by the portion of day habilitation that's 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. So you had made that point earlier, Laura, and you're right, that we can't make any strong conclusions from this because of the fact that there may be other factors in play here, the mix of services, different individual needs, etc.
So this is Chris, and I just want to reiterate and reinforce what Leslie just said, because I think it's so important. I understand there's a lot of information here, and what we're trying to do is disentangle a lot of kind of confounding factors and carve things in different ways to better understand the data. And so we're not necessarily super concerned about the exact position of any specific provider. And we do understand that there are those caveats, like this is meaningful day against meaningful day. What we're trying to better illustrate or better understand through these views are what factors tend to have a bigger or smaller impact, and in which direction around the service type, the staffing ratio, all that kind of information. So again, to Leslie's point, I know she gave us all the information there, but just making sure we have a second to digest and understand that. If you're looking at providers maybe clustered in various spots on the left-hand side of the graph, that's saying that there are some with positive revenue change and some with negative revenue change. If they all had the exact same other situations, we would see them in the exact same spot. But the reason for that variance is other confounding variables, like whether or not they provide more CDS, or whether or not they provide more monthly and milestone services, or whether or not they provide more or fewer hours per day. So there are a lot of confounding factors in there. There are a lot of ways of looking at this. We're trying to address the questions that were raised at the last RAG to give an illustration based on what the data available to us tell us, and see if we can kind of draw some conclusions from that. So I think these are all good points, but I just wanted to reiterate that there's a lot of confounding factors, and we're trying to just take snapshots in certain ways, but keep in mind that there are other pieces at play here.
I just want to say real quickly that I think, for people who use meaningful day supports and have 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 staffing, that I just wonder how much of this is a little bit of a proxy for number of hours used on average, because, for folks, particularly if they're, behavioral support issues, they get 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 staffing, maybe it's counterintuitive, but I think a lot of them are getting, more typically using a full day of supports for a whole host of reasons, particularly if they're living with mom or dad. Mom and dad are usually very supportive of, someone having supports that full day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's a lot of information available. So the first graph that we shared today just kind of showed that raw data. What we're trying to do is carve it in certain ways. And like you mentioned, perhaps I don't know this. I'm just going to pretend for a second. So if we just pretend that we did have this maybe color coded by the number of hours, it could be the case that every single dot above the black line has more than 4 hours per day, and every single line below it has less than 4 hours per day. I don't know that. Or it could be that every dot to the left of some percentage has less than 4 hours, and every dot to the right has some percentage of more than 4 hours per day. We don't really know that. There are a lot of ways that you can look at this. So we're just trying to kind of answer the questions that were raised in the past. But yeah, to your point, there's a lot of confounding factors there. There's a lot of things to keep in mind, and there may be some other relationships. I know when people talk statistics, they often say correlation does not equal causation. And so we don't want to necessarily say there's some impact here, so it must be this cause, but we want to try to just understand what the data are telling us.
Hey, Chris, it's Chris. Just two real observations, and I agree with Laura's point. Without the utilization factor kind of embedded into this, and it's really obviously difficult to do, it's kind of a shot in the dark. But two things that stick out to me, and Laura mentioned too, the 0% column. If I provide no one-on-one or 2-to-1, I got a 50-50 shot of whether I'm winning or losing. The second point, if you look at the chart, really is the more one-on-one you provide, the bigger percentage of that service that I provide as part of my day program. And if you look at it really from just under 25% and up, the bulk of the providers are making money. And I think it really goes back to, there's a need for acuity. And to me, this chart shows it.
I think based on the CDS graph that we saw on the last slide and this slide, what we're trying to say is that there is currently no strong evidence to suggest that the 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 is impactful to, or the portion of 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 services is impactful to the overall revenue change in meaningful day. And again, as we've been saying, that's very dependent on the confounding factors that are being involved here. And like Chris is saying, we're trying to tease that out. And based on the current raw data, we don't see a significant relationship to the portion of DAHAB versus the total revenue change. If we go to the next slide, though, we can talk through the last staffing ratio that we talked about. So we also looked at day habilitation with the lens of portion of a large group. And so here we can see a small pattern emerging from left to right. The larger the portion of DAHAB with large group reported, we're seeing a slight decrease in the change in revenue. And so here we can see a correlation. And so this is something that we want to dig into and evaluate further once we're able to collect some of that additional utilization and staffing data, because we do see a pattern emerging here.
Leslie, it's Chris again. I think if you lay the two charts over top of each other, you start to see a pretty defined pattern. The larger the group, the less revenue, the more likely you are to lose money. And then the flip side of that is the 1-to-1 to 2-to-1. As you provide more of that component, you're more likely to gain revenue. I mean, you've got a larger bulk of providers under the 25% that don't do 50, 75, 100% of 1-on-1 or 2-to-1. That tends to be the smaller providers, unless you're, providing 50 people with 1-on-1 services. But I think if you overlap the two graphs, I think it spells it out pretty clear.
So, Chris, I think that's a fair point. I just want to point out, our intent is to collect additional data for day habilitation. And as part of that request, we are asking for that 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 split. So our hope is that we will have some additional information that kind of teases that out, and we can get a better feel for how those different ways of providing service may impact various cost components, and try to do reviews that way. But that is something that we asked to split out.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And I would actually recommend too is that we start, if we're going to gather additional data at some point, assuming we will continue to do that in the future, that we start to look at the average pay rate that each of these providers is providing. If I am paying $12 an hour and I'm making 100% versus a provider that's paying $17 an hour and they're rated break even or losing money, I think that's a factor we have to look at and consider. I mean, the ultimate goal was to get DSPs to a suitable wage that we could continue to maintain and grow a workforce. So if I am projecting making a boatload of money, but my wages are suppressed from where we believe that they should be, where the BLS points us to, I think that's also a factor we have to consider.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. And what we have, again, from the FIAT, what we're showing on these is just a revenue change to revenue change. So 0% doesn't necessarily mean break even from kind of a gain loss perspective. But using the general ledger data in the past and for data requests in the future, I think the intent is to get expense information like that and look at gain loss kind of information in that way. But again, just what we have here is only revenue.
So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about the data collection tool and everything else that we're doing with FY24 priorities. So Optimus, can you just very quickly run through the third part of your analysis, and then we'll kind of shift to that other discussion?
Sure. If we go to the next slide. The last couple slides that we're going to show is breaking out the changes in revenue based on the categories within meaningful day, such as CDS or day have. So of the meaningful day utilization, how much of the utilization was reported as CDS or as day have for the providers. So the first slide here, next slide, please. The first slide here is looking at the portion of meaningful day with CDS. We can see that there is a pattern here emerging that the greater portion of a provider's business is meaningful day is CDS. The higher there is, the higher their change in revenue is. Next slide, please. The same look is done with day have. So if there's a portion of a provider's business, what portion of provider's business is day habilitation? So from 0% to 100% on the right side. We're seeing relatively flat spread across the graph here. The next slide, we did the same look with career exploration. There wasn't as many providers, and so there isn't really a clear pattern emerging out of this, but we wanted to show all of the looks that we did for meaningful day service groupings. The next slide, please. We split employment services into two separate groupings, one for quarter hour services, which are the 15-minute increments, and then the other one is the monthly and milestone services. And so for here, again, we're not really seeing a clear pattern as to if there's a relationship between the portion of meaningful day that is employment services versus the revenue change. And then the last slide is monthly and milestone services.
That one I'm going to take, Leslie. So I'm actually going to use this slide to help wrap up all of the prior slides. So this one looks at the portion of meaningful day that is monthly and milestone. And one of the things that we want to make certain, just Chris mentioned it earlier, and actually Laura brought it up. We know that there's some variation in the assumptions that people have used as they are filling this out. And so while that tells us that we need to make additional effort to try to standardize the instructions so that we get a little bit more consistent reporting. If you were to take this information and look at the slides in section 2 and section 3, you'll notice that there has not been a lot of correlation in the data points, and we've tried to tease out information. And so what this tells us is, especially if you were to compare this to the prior slide on day habilitation, that we need to tease out the subcomponents of meaningful day. And that's a lot of the feedback that you all have been giving us, this is a very complex issue, and it has a lot of confounding factors that we need to try to get additional information on. And so that leads me to the next slide, which gets at the focal points of the fiscal year 24 rate setting cycle. Up at the top, we are emphasizing data collection on the day habilitation service. We have provided the template for additional data collection. And what we are looking for is feedback on that data collection. We actually got some good feedback today on some potential adaptations to that we may want to look at. The advisory groups received that data template, and once we regroup after today's conversation, the intention is to send out the data template for day habilitation to the provider community. So Jennifer asked me to wrap up the areas 1, 2, and 3. Any questions before we go to slide 26, which is the timeline for the DAHAB rate review for the fiscal year 24 rate process?
Steve, it's Chris. I do have one question in reference to the collection tool, and it's just a clarification. Lines 1, 2, 3, and 4 at the top, where we're actually grabbing the number of individuals. To me, it's not clear whether or not you would want the 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 individuals included in that total number, or if that is a total number excluding the one-on-ones.
Sure. So the intent there in line 1, we had just put total number, and then in 2, we had done number of individuals that have that 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. The intent there is that 1 would be inclusive of 2. I think that's a fair point, and that might be something that we edit before sending out, just for clarity.
Good question. Thanks, Chris.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right, so just keeping us moving along here. I know we have a few more things to get through. So our next slide there is that the timeline for fiscal year 24 priorities. So we're planning to start by distributing the data collection tool, soon after this meeting. We are planning a technical assistance webinar to be held on June 29th, and that's scheduled from 4 to 5 p.m. And that is to provide a quick walkthrough and answer any questions that providers may have on filling out the template. Our intent right now is to have responses returned by July 15th, where Optimus will aggregate that data. We wanted to offer the RAG a preliminary analysis of the data received. So we are looking at moving the RAG meeting from July 15th to July 29th, so that we can collect that information, aggregate it, and share it with you. We wanted to make sure that there's that ability to have that collaboration there. So after that preliminary analysis is complete, internal discussions will take place on the results, along with options for the day habilitation rates. We're planning on presenting those options and having a discussion in the August RAG meeting, and then the state will make final policy decisions after those discussions and after gathering that feedback. So the next few slides will walk through some updates to the data collection tool. So in April, we shared a data collection tool. We got a lot of good comments and feedback for adjustment. We did, hear some conflicting concerns and thoughts. And so we understand that, any data collection, any data request we put out will have some drawbacks, but we want to move forward and collect data in the best way we can and try to account for any changes that we need to keep in mind. So just a quick summary of some of the things we heard. There was some concern around the data collection time period, which had been listed as that first quarter of calendar year 22. And there were concerns around that because of COVID and emergency policies around some of those service provisions. We also heard concerns that providers don't collect data in the way that it was asked for, so we've kind of made some adjustments there. The data collection sections, people asked for better definitions there, and that the language may be unclear. And there was also some questions around policy expectations. So on the next slide, we'll walk through some of the adjustments that we made. So we talked about with the RAG requesting calendar year 19 experience and projections for fiscal year 23 utilization. Those are two separate things. So in the collection tool, the intent is to capture actual experience prior to the pandemic, as well as expectations or projections moving forward, so that we can get both the actual experience and what providers think might be a better picture of how things will look for them. We've also tried to specify things like weekly schedules and monthly totals, and provide the option, if that is too detailed, to just provide a summary. We've allowed for flexibility in the limitations of provider data that way. So we're hoping to essentially collect as detailed of data as providers can provide, with options for them to just kind of provide more summary level data if it's not available. And then we'll see what we get and kind of work from there. We've worked to enhance some of the clarity around the labels and the categories. We tried to clarify the intent, and we're offering that instructional session to kind of walk through. We've also, described the process a little bit in those prior meetings around looking at those percentages, for example, in transportation, or those staffing ratios, and comparing that against the assumptions that were made in the rate development. And then seeing if adjustments need to be made to the data collected and how those comparisons shake out, and if there are certain adjustments that should be made to the rates. But we will, again, update that based on the data availability. Ideally, we're looking for detailed, consistent data. We understand that there are always going to be caveats. There's always going to be obstacles. So we'll provide more updates once we have that data and can speak to it a little more clearly. The next couple slides just show a couple clips from the data collection tool. It sounded like someone might have a question there.
Yeah, Chris, just a couple of things. One, I wonder about giving some small number of providers, asking them to test the tool before it goes broadly to all the providers. I mean, could potentially use some of the providers on the RAG, or maybe some other small group. So that's one question, thought. And the other one is I looked more at the transportation template this morning than the staffing template, but for the transportation template, I'm really worried about how difficult it's going to be for providers to have real data for 19, just because it's so far back, and I don't know that they all, I suspect that many, if not most, probably don't collect parts of that data, and we wouldn't want them to go through that exercise and not have it ultimately be, usable data.
Sure. So I think those are fair questions. Hopefully I get to both of them. Let me know if I miss anything. But for the first one, I think that's a reasonable approach to take. However, we do have some constraints with availability and timelines with regard to the RAG. So if there was an intent to pilot this template, for example, for let's say a week or 2 weeks, that pushes everything back on the timeline, which means we may not be able to meet in July with any data. And I know there were concerns about scheduling something in September. Providers had asked about availability there, and I think the state has other availability concerns too. So I'm not going to make any sort of decision on this. This is really more up to the state, but that was something that was considered, and that was something that ultimately I think at the moment the intent was to try to move forward with what we have and try to collect the best data available. And to the second point there, we understand that. We heard that comment that in 19, this data might not be available. or not split out the way that we're requesting it. And so what we're doing is we're asking providers to share data as much as they can. And we've also included a spot for projections, understanding that recent data may help understand what things may look like, but might not get the full picture because they're still, kind of adjusting to the pandemic or some of the, recent changes with, the hiring and workforce environment. And so there's some changes that, might be a little bit misleading right now. We heard that as well. So we wanted to offer providers both the opportunity to present data, if available, and expectations moving forward if that data isn't available, and to help us understand if they're both available, what that change might look like.
So just one more thing. I'm wondering how much having that 19 data really helps us. I mean, things have changed considerably around transportation costs and presumably projected utilization. And I just wonder whether, how helpful that data is really going to be.
So the providers, and we've received this feedback in the advisory group, have pushed back on using the pandemic data. And so this is the agreed upon solution, because the feedback was that you can't use the pandemic data. So we need to choose a data source, and the feedback was, well, if you have to choose one, let's choose some that's pre-pandemic.
Right, but remember that discussion, but why will old data help us? Because I'm looking at the next slide you have on transportation, and I mean, if the question is we're trying to get at like total non-billable hours, we don't know that that's really going to tell us anything about FY23. And I look, the non-wage transportation costs, I'm just trying to understand how that data will actually be helpful, as opposed to just having a comparison.
Yeah, so I think, from our experience, we work in a lot of states on a lot of different programs, and almost every single time there are going to be changes in what's expected to happen in the future from what happened in the past. And we understand that this, may have its own very specific set of differences between what happened in the past and what happened in the future. That being said, the intent is to collect actual experience on some level, and then try to account for, to the best of our ability, expected changes. And so one of the things, for example, that we've put in here is for providers to share both their experience and their expectations so that we can do a comparison there. We've also asked qualitatively for providers to enter information about why they think things may change. So even if that comparison point is not available to us, that can help inform decisions about how we might look at adjusting the data. So the intent is to have a starting point that may not be perfect, because a perfect starting point is not available to us, but to get the best starting point that we can, try to account for changes that are expected and use that to the best of our ability to project what things may look like going forward.
Hi, this is Scott. I did spend some time looking at this. Truthfully, it's going to be hard for me to do 19 data. I feel pretty confident that I can project, because I've spent a lot of time on projecting services. I mean, is it okay if a provider doesn't provide any 19 data? And how's that going to impact you all? Because I just feel like for me, it's going to be hard to do 19, but I can give it my best shot for the projection.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we've been hearing that from providers that some may or may not be able to provide things in one way or the other. So I think for us to move forward, what we're going to do is request as much information as is available, and then see what information we are able to collect, and then use that to the best of our ability. So if no providers at all are able to provide any experience, but they are able to provide projections, we'll have to take that under consideration. If they, maybe most are able to provide data and one or two aren't able to, that might be used a different way. It's really, if we try to specify what's right for any individual provider, it may not be generalizable enough to everyone. So our intent here is to ask for as much detailed data as we can, have that expectation that providers populate any information they are able to populate. And then once we have that information, then we can try to, look at what information we are able to collect so that we can better make an informed decision. If we have no data, then we have to, go off the premise that no data are available and we need to look another way. If we do have data, then we can say, oh, we do have data, we may need to adjust it, here's how we might do that. But we don't really know until we put this out there and see kind of broadly what information we are able to collect.
That's good, that's fair. We do what we can. From a statistics standpoint, what % of the providers would you hope would respond in order to make this statistically relevant?
I don't think we have specified a number there. I think we're kind of expecting to get a range of information and try to see how that plays out. So there may be, a majority that are able to provide, again, that experience. There may be a majority that are able to provide only the expectations. There may be a minority of one or the other, or both. So there's a lot of ways that it could kind of play out. I don't think we have a specific number in mind, but I think that is a really good point. And we want to make sure that once we have information, we're looking at how representative it is and try to account for that in any projections or any, assumptions we draw from that data interpretation.
I guess, Chris, when this tool goes out, will you be communicating? Because I would hate for, when I think about my organization, for 2019, we deliver transportation in a completely different way than we deliver transportation now. And I would hate to put a lot of effort into trying to create something for 2019 that, because we absolutely didn't collect data this way. We had a fleet of vehicles and drivers. So our DSPs weren't even doing the transportation. So it's going to be extremely difficult for us to figure it out. And our vehicles are not by service. They're vehicles that pick people up and then people go about their lives. So it's going to be extremely difficult for us to do this, but I wouldn't want any provider to receive this and try to figure out how to pull 2019 data that may or may not make sense if they didn't collect it this way. So would we, in sending out the information, will you specify that if you don't readily have 2019 data available, to just go to the data for 2023?
Yes, I think we've put that in instructions, but we can make sure that that's there and clearly marked. Again, every provider is going to have a different situation. And so that's where we ask for that quantitative data to populate these tables, as well as that qualitative data, so that, if you have that change in how transportation is delivered and you put that, qualitatively in that notes section where we ask for that information, and we end up seeing a similar response from many providers, then maybe that's something we can talk about. Why is this changing? How does that change impact the assumptions that go into the rates? So yeah, I think we'll try to make sure that is very clear, that we're asking to populate as much information as is readily available. And we'll try to work from the information that we can collect, as well as, again, making sure that we're clear on asking providers to share that qualitative data. Also, just a reminder, we do have that session. We have that instructions section on our first tab where we do have some email addresses for providers to reach out if they do have questions, as well as that instructional session to walk through the ideas, about how to populate this information and for providers to ask those questions and get some responses. So we do have that kind of lane of communication open, but those are good points. We'll make sure that everything is as clear as possible in the instructions there.
Chris, it's Chris. Just one other recommendation in reference to the tool. With fuel costs being such a large part of the non-wage transportation cost, and there being such a huge difference between 19 and 21, I think it'd be my recommendation that you break fuel out of that category and give it its own line so that you can see the impact.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. We can take that under consideration. And again, that's there's a lot of ways to look at this, and we're asking for some of those quantitative and qualitative differences that might be experienced. So I think that's a very fair point and something that we would want to consider in again making those changes from what the experience is to what the projection is. So I know we were on one of the template slides. We had two slides here just to kind of do a quick walkthrough. So, it sounds like most of you have reviewed this already, but just to do kind of a quick walkthrough, if we go back, I think the first slide here is for that day habilitation service staffing ratio. And so the idea here is we have this tab repeated multiple times for day habilitation and other services like CDS, as well as a summary tab, so that if providers are not able to split this out by those service groups, that they are able to the best of their ability, populate kind of a more summarized look. And so this is the general information here is we're looking for individuals in day habilitation, we're looking for the staffing, and we're also looking to split that out by individuals that require at least a one-on-one staff ratio, so one-on-one or two-on-one. We also heard feedback that, providing this kind of an aggregate may be difficult, so we're asking for a schedule to be populated here. It sounded like that data may be more readily available. And then again, if that's not, available, that can all just be thrown into one day, and we'll work with what we're able to collect there. But the idea here is to split that out as much as possible without intending to be overly burdensome, and have those opportunities available for providers to offer more summarized data if that is what's available to them. Again, this section we have for 2019, that was some of the feedback and the recommendations from the REG. And then we have an identical section directly adjacent to it that would be for expectations going forward. So we can account for some of those differences. So this is for, we have those, 3 meaningful day kind of service categories are repeated. And then the next slide there is for transportation. Again, we have this populated, or this available by service grouping. We're asking for the hours of DSP time. Again, we understand this may be difficult to parse out. So again, the best of providers' ability or what's available to them. But we're looking at, what kind of direct care billable hours that they are, providing versus transportation hours versus other non-billable hours that are not related to transportation. We understand that not all providers will be able to split those out. So again, we're just asking providers to populate it to the best of their ability, and we'll make decisions once we have a good picture of what information is available. And so the intent there is to take kind of a first look at the transportation time relative to the billable time, and seeing, if that percentage is relatively in line with the rate assumptions, or if that's, if that's missed the mark in any certain category. So again, it's split out in day habilitation, CDS, and again, also understanding that there are changes. So we have this for data and that expectation moving forward, so we can see what that might look like. We also asked for the transportation costs that are not related to wages. It sounded like Chris was recommending that we split out gas, so that's something we can take into consideration. And we have a line for the total DSP wages. Again, those relativities that are built into the model are based on kind of costs versus wages. And so we wanted to parse this out. We know there has been some discussion in the past about transportation time versus transportation specific costs that are not related to time, and whether or not those components have been adequately addressed in the model. So we want to collect both of those pieces of information so that we can work forward with what we collect. So I think that's what we have for the data collection tool, but I'll just pause there and see if there's any other questions around that.
Chris, no questions, just a comment really. I still think it's a fairly quick turnaround for providers from training on the 29th to the 15th, knowing that for 95% of them, it's the end of the fiscal year.
Sure. Yeah, that's something that we had discussed internally. So again, we can reconvene with the state and see if there's expectations there or ideas around that. But I think that is at the moment our path forward to try to stick with timelines that are available to us, the best option that we have. If it becomes overly burdensome or providers are not able to provide that information in time, then that's something where we can reconsider. But we can also circle back with the state and make sure that that's the timeline that they'd like to go moving forward. But yeah, I think that's a very good point, and we definitely understand that that's a busy time with that fiscal year turnover.
I mean, I think that this timeline was kind of our attempt to, as best we could, balance I guess the overall timeline that we need to meet, driven by the state budget cycle, but also the concerns about fiscal year close and just other scheduling concerns in general, and the amount of time it will take providers to populate this data. So that's kind of how we arrived at where we did. I mean, I would like to see us try to hit these deadlines, but if it does become a major problem, we can certainly reevaluate. But trying to find that balance between getting meaningful data and meeting our deadline. So we're always trying to balance those two things in everything that we're doing.
I think the meaningful data piece is really, really important. And so, I mean, to what Karen said earlier, I think we need to somehow relay to the providers, we really need their assurance that they're able to gather this data and that they have it and that the numbers they're putting in are in fact relevant, so that we don't end up with data that is pointless. I mean, when you look through the data tool, there's going to be a number of providers who are not going to be able to pull that. I'm sure there are going to be a number of providers who can't pull that. And I'd rather they know up front not to just put data in, just don't do it. Versus there should be a substantial number of providers who can do it. But I don't know how we address that.
Well, and Donna, the other thing I would say is, I also don't know, even if providers had the 19 data, again, how applicable it is to where we are currently. And to Karen's point about how so many providers provide transportation differently. So.
So, I mean, I think the bottom line is our work and our decisions are going to be data driven. So we're going to be asking for data. And I know in some cases that's going to be more challenging than others, which is why I think we can design this template to have options depending on what a provider has available. I mean, I think something we can do is kind of try to work into, see what we can do to kind of work into our communications and the webinar material to address some of these concerns.
Just one other thing, which is, even if providers have the data, it is going to be a tremendous amount of work and a short turnaround time at the end of the fiscal year. So if the department goes ahead with asking for this, I would just say, I also don't want to see providers kill themselves to do it if it's ultimately not going, there won't be enough volume of data to make it really useful or helpful, or to collect it, but to collect part of it, and then we don't know how helpful it is because there's other data that's missing.
As I said before, all of our decisions are going to be data driven, so we need data. So we are going to provide as much assistance as we can through the webinar and other methods to get the best data that we can.
So we fully support data. We love data, but this is going back and asking for data that's never been collected really in this way, going back basically 4 fiscal years with a major global pandemic in between. So this is far from your typical data collection. Of course, we support data, this being data driven, but a lot of rate changes have been made so far that weren't really data driven, or data driven from a handful of providers. So I would just say, I want to be clear, we support it, but we don't want to go down a road of collecting data that isn't really useful and helps drive this process in a way that makes sense.
So, I mean, I think, and this is something we're going to talk more about at next month's meeting, we're going to have kind of a more comprehensive data collection effort in future years that we've already started working on the templates for that. And I think kind of in the future, providers will be able to get into more of a rhythm. There'll be technical assistance. It'll become more standardized longer term. But this effort is because we've been hearing concerns about rehabilitation and a desire to try to address those sooner rather than later. So this is our effort to try to respond to those concerns, using data.
And we appreciate the fact that you're trying to respond to that.
Just to follow up to that conversation, it's kind of the same concern I have about the cost report tool and any potential changes to it. I mean, I think that tool long-term needs to be designed to grab these type of data points that we're looking at now, because we're going to need them again in the future. But then to follow, looking back, we're not prepared to gather the 19 data because we didn't know we needed it. And I'm going to reiterate my point, which is if we're going to make changes to the cost report, we've got to get them to the provider community before the start of the fiscal year so they can plan to gather that data that we need to report 18 months from now. We've got to give that information.
Completely agree with you on that.
So, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Right. Any more comments on the data collection tool? All right. And why don't we move forward to the next slide? All right. So to recap the timeline Chris shared earlier in the meeting, the data collection tool will be distributed following this meeting. A technical assistance webinar will be held on June 29th from 4 to 5 p.m. to answer any questions providers may have on filling out the template. Communication about that webinar is in process and will be shared with the broader provider network. Please have all data collection tools returned by July 15th, and Optimus will then aggregate that data. The webinar on the 29th will also include submission instructions. In order to offer the RREG preliminary analysis of the data received, we are moving the RREG meeting from July 15th to July 29th. We know that this is also the same date as the Deputy Secretary webinar. So DDA will cancel their July webinar to ensure the community has the opportunity to attend the RREG. Again, after the preliminary analysis is complete, internal discussions will take place on the results, along with any option generated from those results for the DHAB rates. And we would then plan to present those options and have discussion at the August 19th RREG meeting. And then the state would make final policy decisions following that meeting after discussions and potentially gathering additional feedback if needed. Go to the next slide, please. Just a reminder that all meeting materials will be made available through the designated DDA webpage for the advisory group. We will also be posting the links to the updated FIATs, both the unlocked and the locked version, on that page. Next slide, please. Thank you again for your attendance and your commitment to this work. I do genuinely appreciate all your engagement and your feedback. And we look forward to continuing our discussion on Friday, July 29th at 12:30. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.